Welcome to Markigy, the science of marketing strategy, a bi-weekly podcast where all the cool marketers discuss their favorite marketing strategies, study by study. On this show, we feature marketing risk takers who believe long-term wins for the customer equal long-term wins for the business too. How? Human-led marketing, the combination of where science, creativity, and strategy meet, or as we also like to call it, Markigy. Let's break down the marketing trends, myths, and methodologies together. I'm your host, Leanne Dow-Weimer. Let's go. Hello. I am joined today by Casey Hill, the head of growth at Bonjoro. He is an institutional consultant. He is the founder. He does so many amazing things and wears so many hats. And I'm so happy to have you here today. Casey, tell us just a quick little bit about what's going on in your life right now.
Thanks, Leanne, for having me. So you touched on some of the most important thing that's happening in my life is I just had a newborn, 4 months old currently. So that's definitely a big shift. And on the work end, I work for a technology company called Bonjoro, and I run the growth department, doing a lot of organic marketing and a little bit of kind of sales style work. I work with McKinsey and BlackRock and Goldman's and a lot of different institutional firms that are basically preparing to look at whether they should make investments in companies that are going to their Series A through Series D. And then I also teach. So I teach at UCSD. I teach content marketing. And so hopefully helping give some direct kind of industry experience into the educational system. So hopefully helping people out in that capacity. So those are some of the buckets.
Awesome. I love it. And I mean, I'm so grateful that people are stepping up and understanding the kids in college need to be taught more than they were getting 10 years ago. But I kind of want to circle back to something that you mentioned earlier, Bonjoro. So tell me about your growth direction there and what it offers and how that's relevant as a marketing strategy.
Yeah, for sure. So Bonjoro does a couple different things. So one of the things Bonjoro does is personal video. So we kind of saw that we saw this trend that was happening in market where a lot of like companies just have very kind of like stale, automated, either a lead comes in or a customer comes in, they get a series of emails, and we wanted to help companies kind of have more of that human touch of interaction. So we created this one-to-one video platform that allowed you to quickly record a one-to-one video and say, hey, insert person's name and kind of create that connection point. And once we did that, we started getting a lot of traction there, but we also started to realize we're creating a lot of advocacy, but we wanted to showcase that advocacy in some way. So then the second thing that we delivered at Bonjoro was the ability to gather video testimonials, to take that same kind of personalization and make that customer into a marketer, make that customer into an advocate, and take that positive experience and kind of help that brand capitalize on that more in a way that's obviously really low cost. In the world today where we see customer acquisition costs like rising and rising, and all these teams are going through really heavy burn rates in kind of the PPC market and pay-per-click advertising, we're always looking for ways to help people be able to kind of organically have more of that growth. I think using your customers is an awesome way to do that. So those are the two kind of pillars of what Bonjoro is and what we're trying to do with it.
That's so cool. And I mean, I think that there's so much value in that user generated content, that UGC, that's been trending for a long time, but it's been hard for organizations to make it actionable and part of an ongoing strategy. So not to feel like I'm sales pitching, but at the same time, there's so much value in being able to capture that. Um, Now, how does this differentiate between just like, reposting something that someone did? Like let's say there was an influencer or you're doing influencer marketing. Where do you see the value being more driven in this method and have it be repeatable, I guess, in this sense?
Yeah, so a couple thoughts on that. So the first, I think, major challenge is that a lot of like customer feedback that comes into you tends to be like very generic. Like the way that most people do this is they have a little button that says like leave us a review, right? And an
Yeah.
email goes out after X amount of time and leave us a review. So the first thing that we did is we basically made it so the survey that captures these videos asks very specific questions. So if you understand your business and you know what the pain points are, maybe that's around trust, maybe it's around the price point, maybe it's around competition. Instead of generically asking for questions, you can ask very specific questions that correspond to the specific pain points that people have. So that's what's going to actually help drive the conversions. So that I think is an important piece of the puzzle is like having very specific answers to very specific questions. And then I think another part of this is figuring out ways to systematize it or work it into a system in a way that's a little more strategic. So you can ask specific questions of everyone, right? But you might find that there's a couple ways you can go a layer deeper. So one example of this is if you don't have a lot of contact with them, you might want to keep it very simple. That's like one specific question. But if you use something like lead scoring in your system and you see the person super engaged and they're like a super fan, capitalize on it. Ask them 5, 6 questions. They'll give you that information and you're not treating everyone the same, right? The person you have minimal contact with, person you have a lot of contact with. So you can get kind of smart. You can use lead scoring. Some people use things like an NPS survey. Anyone who says like 9 or 10 on my NPS survey basically will get populated to leave us feedback. So you can start looking at those specific spots, as well as I'm a big fan, and I think it's really underutilized to do social monitoring. And what I mean by that is if someone you have your little survey, you can drop that to someone at any time. When people call you out, when people say positive things about you, be right there to capture them in that moment of positive attention around your brand. Drop in that survey right there. And often you can grab a handful of people every month just by being attentive to those social channels and capitalizing it right then, not 2 months later when that moment is kind of faded, but when they've had that positive experience right in that exact instance.
Yeah, I agree strongly. It's a hill I will die on, is that you need to ask for feedback when the emotion is the strongest because it'll be the most robust. It's just like anything else, psychology wise with people or anywhere that we see this. Like you wouldn't, let's say you were dog training and you're teaching your dog to sit. You wouldn't wait a week to give it a treat. You would do it right when it sat. Obviously human beings are a little bit more nuanced, but you still understand that there is a separation between the feeling in the moment and then having it fade and capturing it
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah.
Um,
And that just is one other quick comment on that. That also feeds into a lot of people when they're gathering testimonials, they kind of struggle. Like the biggest piece of feedback I come back with is, well, people just aren't willing to give us testimonials. People just aren't raising their hand to do it. So one of the things I think is really important that kind of can be connected to that last point is make it about them. Make it about their journey, their transformation. So if, for instance, when someone posts, that's a really easy opportunity. For instance, they just got a great result and you reach out and say, you have such an amazing journey. Like, thank you so much for being with us over this last year. Like, would you be able to tell people about how it was going from 0 to 1 of where you're at? And now you're making it all about them versus the opposite, which always feels like an ask from customers. Can you give us a review? Can you it's a different dynamic when you're like, I want to highlight this incredible journey, this incredible result, this incredible insert their benefit point. So I think if you do that and and then connected to that too, another thing is you can highlight the benefit to them. So the other thing is when I have it as part of a system, when it's going out automatically, you might say something like, hey, we're running a series on customer stories that we're going to be sharing out to 20,000 of our people on our email list. And we'd love to have your logo on our homepage. That sounds so much more enticing and interesting. Person's like, this is going out to a lot of people. My logo is going to be on their homepage. That feels so much different, right? Dynamic wise than like, can you give us a review? So that's just another really important part of this conversation. Like for anyone listening, if you're struggling to get people to give you testimonials, switch that verbiage, make it more about them and their benefit, and you'll get better uptake.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of to echo this is that when brands struggle the most, they're focusing on themselves. And when they have the smoothest, less friction, best results is when they're really actually focusing on the customer and making it a win-win. It doesn't have to be, and I think this is where, sales and marketing used to be very like, give me, give me, give me. I'm going to manipulate. I'm going to pressure. It doesn't have to be like,
Yeah. Yeah,
um,
no, I totally agree. And I think especially, I mean, in certain markets like tech that I come from, it's like that's shown so prominently. Like the best salespeople are really just good consultants. They're good people that know their industry, they're experts, and it's not about that at all. Like HubSpot published a study, which I thought was really interesting, where they had like a list of all these attributes they evaluated new hires on. And one of them was objection handling. And objection handling was like way down at the bottom. Like at the top, it was like preparedness, domain knowledge. And the reason was the people who knew the industry really, really well, they were actually able to just like provide the value at the top where they weren't stuck in the defensive mode of just dealing with objections all the time. So it was actually like they didn't even have to worry about getting into that spot. I thought that was a really interesting takeaway from obviously one of the big tech giants out there in HubSpot, to see that good sales can really just be like someone who steps in there and is honest and authentic and explains the industry in a robust way.
Yeah, the preparedness is huge because in order to be accurately prepared, you have to go after your customer and know how it's relevant, why it matters, and speak to their actual reasons why they're talking to you, instead of trying to fit, a square in a circle.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I like the most, kind of going off on, back to the video aspect of this, is that feeling of connectedness when we see people's faces. How
Mhm.
do you think that impacts what you're doing?
Yeah, I think video is huge for a lot of reasons. Like number one is I think if we just think psychologically, you go to a website and you see a review, and your first thought, I'm sure that there's many people that are like me. One of the first thoughts is like, is this even just real? Right? Like, did they just write this themselves and like slap on some random person's name? Right? There's not that visibility for you to understand, and so I think all of us like to feel like we can assess trustworthiness when we see a person. There's
Mhm.
tone, there's body language, there's facial expressions, there's all these things. And in our head, we're making those little cues like, okay, this is a trustworthy person or this is not a trustworthy person. So when you put video and you have someone who can build that affinity and has that tone and feels like, yes, this is a real person, I think that just carries a lot of impact. And I think back to a TED talk I watched, which I've always thought was super interesting. It was a memory expert. He takes two rooms, he divides them. In one room, he tells them at the very beginning, I want you to remember the word baker, right? I want you to remember the word baker, the name. The other one, he says, I want you to remember someone whose profession is a baker. And the one that chose the profession did substantially better. And the reason for it was context. So when you think of the profession of a baker, you're thinking of maybe like the white hats and the smells. And most people have probably been to a bakery at some point in their lives. Whereas with just the word, it was just a word in isolation. There's no context around it. So when you think about why video matters in terms of people being able to remember it and retention and it kind of standing out, a lot of this comes down to the context. And that's, I don't want to go into deep into the bio side of this, but I think that's a really interesting takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we're people that exist in multiple contexts, right? And so we already know that having just the social proof on your landing page matters. We already know, like, it's just facts that having that social proof done correctly helps to impact the way that you're gonna get your conversion rate on that landing page, because people care what other people, they want that sense of, okay, like, this is credible, this is real, this isn't just spam, I'm not gonna get scammed on this. But then when they can feel that connection with video, is that it just takes it to the next level, in my opinion.
Yeah.
um
Right. And I think too, yeah, I totally agree. And I think too, there's something to like the specificity that's also really important. So if you think about like someone saying like, oh, I've just had such an amazing experience with my brand, I'm getting so many more demos, like feels very general versus someone who comes in and says, before we started using insert company, we were getting 44 demos booked per week across three of our reps. And over the first 3 months since we've implemented insert solution, we've actually increased that to 110. We actually had to hire another sales rep just to deal with that volume. To me, at least, when I hear the two, the second one is way more compelling. I'm thinking about the numbers contextualized and they're explaining all the periphery, right? Like even having to bring in a new sales rep that makes me really like understand and relate to that person's situation. And if I'm a smaller sales team and I hear that, I'm like, they're exactly where I want to be in this next step. And that builds so much trust. So I think that also goes into the not only video, but asking specific questions and getting specific insights to help that really have the persuasive power that you want it to have. And every brand is a little bit different. And so when it comes to this, some people, it resonates with a little bit more of an emotional voice. Some people are very like quantifiable, hard data to show me exactly what the impact is. So you have to know your brand a little bit. But I think either way, getting into the specifics before and after and having questions that kind of lead the person through that is how you'll have the highest converting pieces of video content that you can put onto your site.
Absolutely. I think that, the questions that you're asking is one of the biggest differentiators in marketing. Whether like just across the board, whether it's what you're asking, yourself, what you're asking your data, what you're asking your customers. And, I've seen it firsthand where a series of questions, and I don't want to call it leading the witness because that sounds manipulative, but it helps them internalize and come up for themselves an answer that you're hoping they would come up with, which is that your brand did what it promised. It did what it said it could. It provided value and their lives are better off for it. Or if they come to the opposite conclusion, hopefully I know that I have it set up in, my personal loops to say, if I didn't meet that, let's have a conversation. How can I improve?
Yeah.
And, that's an important question to ask as well is if this didn't meet your expectations, why didn't it? And then you start
Yeah.
to get into that win-loss interview area.
100%. Yeah. And I know that's a tricky one for people, like people who are leaving or who don't convert on your trial, who aren't interested. It can be really challenging sometimes to get those pieces of feedback. But I think, again, you try to be as human as possible with it. You don't put any pressure on them around it, but really just like, hey, we'd love to like learn from this experience. And you're always going to get a smaller percentage of those people than obviously the active people. But even a few of those people that are willing to kind of sit down and give you some context can really help you quite a bit in optimizing your journey. So yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also that idea that if you're really, really, truly making someone very, very angry, you'd rather hear about it rather than through your own channels than find out through a post on a third party review platform when you couldn't fix it with them or you didn't have that still conversation to make things right.
Yeah, 100%. I think those people often will, even if they were unhappy, they'll be less likely to leave that like scorching review if they feel like you came to them in earnest and were like, hey, I'm really sorry this didn't work out. Like, I hope you find a good thing. I've even had times where I recommend specific competitors, which people think is crazy, but I'm like, I understand the importance of like the overall brand reputation. And if they're not happy, I want them to find a spot where they're going to have that net positive experience. And then maybe when they have the specific need that aligns with our company, they'll come back down the line or they'll refer a friend like, oh, these people are actually really straightforward.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry to take us down the, wrong fit category, but whenever we're dealing with, human interaction and recorded video testimonials and things like that, we need to think of both sides of it. So in that sense, who do you think benefits the most from this type of strategy, this type of play, I guess?
Yeah. So when you're asking that, are you asking what types of companies do you think are like kind of the best and not the best fit for like gathering testimonials?
A little bit of yeah, let's go that way.
Yeah, so I think that to me, the majority of company types can benefit from customer proof. But obviously, I think we can all think of examples. Like if you are a toilet paper company, might be a little bit weird, right, for you to go out and have testimonials. So I think there are certain industries by their nature that are a little bit less open to that. But I find that whether you're in tech or you're in e-commerce or you're a creator, or you're a brick and mortar, there's a pretty wide span of company types that I do think can still benefit quite a bit from having that kind of forward human touch. And the nature of those conversations might be really different depending on the type of business. One is like a B2P enterprise tech company, and another one is a life coach, right? The type of narrative that you'll see between those, and one might be very much focused on emotion and your overall personal transformation, your personal progress. Another one might be very hard data focused, but I think both can still benefit from having video. So I would say that it's a fairly wide net when it comes to ideal industries of using video. The biggest differentiation is probably like the type of video and the presentation of that. But definitely there are certain companies. If I was a toilet paper company, I probably would not be putting video testimonials out there. So I'm sure that there is a handful where that would be the case.
Definitely. And what comes to mind too was companies that might have like HIPAA or financial privacy ones, where you have to be very careful what you ask and how you ask it.
Definitely.
Aside from that, there's always a consideration for companies when they're looking at reputation management of who they highlight and doing a thorough background research of the people whose testimonials they feature. Um, we've seen time and again in the news where a certain person may make remarks that are not aligned with brand strategies. So, there's that consideration. But beyond that, for the most part, I would say the majority of testimonials you get seem to be pretty relevant and useful. Is that
Yeah, and I think you bring up a couple of good points. Like I definitely think, I mean, the way that I think about it is when you're gathering testimonials, I think most companies are not going to feature every single testimonial they gather. Maybe some will, but there's always, I think, typically there's kind of a screening side of the process where you're going to bring these in and you're going to kind of take the ones that are the best highlight of this specific thing. And maybe you use the other ones in some alternative capacity, but in terms of like the on your website, you're going to want those to have good lighting. You're going to want those to have these other pieces that are going to best kind of showcase the product. And one thing that we do, like in Bonjoro testimonials product, is there's a little instructions panel when you start out. And I always encourage people, like, let them know those basics about like how their lighting should be. Let them know those basics of like what kind of frame they should be using, just so that they're prepared to give you content that you can actually use. Because definitely have experienced this, like been in the space for a long time. People come to me like, yeah, we got reviews, but the person's doing it from their iPhone and it's like all janky and like I can't put that on my website. So they end up like taking a video and like transcribing the text and then using the text anyways because they can't use it. So the way to get around that is just to try to give as clear of instructions as you can to people up front. Don't expect them to be the video expert. You should be the one saying like, have the light in front of you instead of behind you, and or do it in front of a window or whatever type of deal to kind of make it as easy as possible.
definitely? And then, I think you back to video testimonials that I've gathered, just manually, is like there's still a way to export a frame from it and use the person, in a good pose and, the best shot from the video. And you can do the moving text. Like there's different ways to make it interesting and still use that content and make it useful without it being just the clip.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with that. And I mean, that's true of so many different forums of video, right? Like I run a podcast called CLTV University. And one of the major things I do inside of Riverside is pull like short, concise clips from those conversations that are helpful. So if I'm doing a post about a certain concept and I just have a 1 minute video, um, that works great. And so I think that totally makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of doing exactly that with, whether it's a recorded interview, whether it's a podcast, whatever the medium is, just taking the nuggets from it and then sharing that across multiple formats because not everybody is that visual digester, especially from longer form content. Um,
Absolutely.
and then one thing that we focus more on the testimonials aspect of this idea, but what about when you started off, you were talking about the individualized video to directly to people. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, for sure. So when people sign up, so we're a software product. When someone signs up for a trial, we basically have Bonjoro connected to our system intercom on the back end. It automatically pops up a task on my phone and it says, Sarah just signed up for a demo. And it has all the information from the system. So I can see like their industry, anything that I have in my CRM shows up right in that panel. So then I can quickly click, record a video and say, hey, it's awesome that you just signed up. I see that you're in the e-commerce space. That's phenomenal. We deal with a ton of online sellers. Some of the best things we're seeing right now are blank, 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 and blank. If you want to call with our team, I'm going to attach a calendar. Feel free to book in, or if you have any questions, respond directly back. So it's just this way to have a much more immersive experience. And so many people write back and are like, number one, super surprised that the head of a growth team reached out to them. They're like, whoa, okay, like didn't expect. And also super surprised that like I actually saw their website or I saw some pieces of context that were personalized to them. So I think when people see that little like waving GIF in their inbox, almost everyone still assumes it's automated. They assume it's like they're going to click on it and it's going to be like, hey, person, like, welcome to the journey. They don't expect to hear their name and to hear someone who's done a little bit of due diligence. And so I think that's a really cool experience where it just kind of sticks out. It sticks out from all the noise. So much of us, I think everyone listening to this can relate to the noise in the inbox. We get so much stuff. And so it's just if you have something that's so differentiated, that becomes more memorable. And then I think that builds a little bit more connection with that brand and kind of motivation. So I think it's great to use as part of that initial touch point, whether that's like interacting with a new lead or whether that's interacting with a new customer. That's the other thing too. Like we have so many service based businesses where, say, someone's going out and getting a quote for a job from 4 companies. You're the only one who reaches back out with an actual video of you who says, like, hey, thank you so much for reaching out. Just like wanted to let you know a little more. Hey, actually check out our team. And you're like panning the phone and showing some people behind it. It's like that feels like, whoa, no one else that they reach out to for a quote is going to be doing that. And so it kind of elevates you in terms of like your ability to really like understand marketing, understanding that domain, like if it was an agency, for example. So I think that's a little bit about how I think about personal video. It's setting the tone, and then people obviously can use it throughout the customer journey to celebrate milestones with people. To we had one guy who I just love this use case, so I want to share. He uses it actually for support. And so he is a person who teaches people how to craft guitars. And he has his whole tool wall set up on the back. And when someone writes in a question, he has it hooked up. He uses Keep, and I believe it's called like Fuse Desk or something. Hopefully, I didn't butcher that. So basically, all he has to do is when their support request comes in, he just clicks a little button, it tags it in Keep, it creates the Bonjoro video on his phone, and then he can like show the actual tool. And he's like, you want to be using a something, something bevel. And he's like showing it behind him. And he's like, that's going to help you do blah, blah, blah. And then he clicks send. And he's got like a 98% open rate, 98% watch rate. Like I've never heard of this. I come from 10 years of the email world. Like his engagement is insane. And I think it's because it's high quality, it's video, and he's also doing it to like people with high intent, people that are seeking an answer. So there's a lot of kind of cool and creative ways to infuse it throughout your customer journey, I think.
Absolutely. And then one thing that I've heard of people trying to use AI for this, and this is where I personally don't think you should use AI. I think it defeats the purpose and it ends up looking really creepy. Uh, and that's my 2 cents. If I'm wrong, like, there's plenty of great cases and AI has come so far so fast. Places where AI belongs. The pictures on your website, pulling together the information that you share on your website. Absolutely. There's some really cool companies that do that. But when you're making that outreach to an individual on that one-to-one basis, the last thing you want to do is make them feel marketed to, make them feel like you couldn't be bothered, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes, despite our best intentions as marketers, that's what AI does, is it makes people feel like they're just anybody. And no one wants to feel like that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think AI is definitely big and is here to stay, and like synthesizing a big data, as you said, is going to be used in many different ways. But yeah, AI video seems tricky for many reasons to deliver the same human experience. And I mean, there's so much like conversation. Obviously, we know like I think it's like Jasper, and there's so many different like AI writing tools that have emerged. I think there's a lot of utility across some of these different tools, but I think there's still a bigger gap than some people think between where that's at and like top level content that performs. I think about a lot of the stuff that I post on channels like LinkedIn are things that come directly from my own experience. Last week I launched this campaign and this is what it's like. And I think it's going to take a long time for AI to be able to like emulate that type of thing. It's different than going like, here's 3 tips to optimize your website. Like, yeah, we can do that fairly quickly by just taking in 1,000 blog articles and spitting out insights. But if you have stuff that's actually human and personalized and from experience, I think that's still going to be the type of content that stands out and drives the most impact. So I think I align with kind of how you're thinking about that motion.
Yeah, I see it as a major differentiator, right? Because at some point, anyone with a budget can just fit out AI content, right? And so how do you then differentiate your brand and your offerings to somebody when you're all using the same tools, right? And the way to do that is to be aggressively you and to accept them aggressively for who they are. And I love the word aggressively and it super turns people off. What I mean by this, I don't mean like violently, is I mean like earnestly, like for real, for not holding back is what I mean in this sense. Um,
Yeah.
because that word is, kind of a tricky one. But when you wholesomely and earnestly take your ideal customer profile and you know them as a human being, as a person, and you really get deep with what that looks like, that differentiates you so dramatically, especially in this day of age where there's so many large corporations and there's so many things that can happen where you feel like a number. And, it's the difference between going to the same restaurant every day and saying hi and having a relationship with someone because you have all those touch points and going to like a vending machine, right?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And I think also one of the things that I always try to be really clear with people is I think sending a personal video is a great way to set the stage. But I also don't want to like mislead people to say like sending a personal video and suddenly you have a relationship. No, a
No.
relationship is a two-way back and forth, right? And so one of the things I think is really interesting is I did a study. I combed through all of our data and I looked at what was the difference in conversion. Because remember, one of our first touch points is trials for people that didn't receive a video, people that received one video and either didn't respond or they responded once, and people that responded 3 or more times, which means that there was an actual back and forth thread. And what we found is there was an elevation when they received one video, but it wasn't crazy. It wasn't like some like complete game changer. But the people that responded at least 3 times, it was a 70% lift. I mean, massive percent lift. And that was because that was the start of an actual relationship where they were sharing things. They were telling you about where they're at. You're sharing where you're at. You're relating in some sort of actual human way. Just a couple days ago, I was doing welcome Bonjoros with my 4-month-old, and I would start the video with like the stroller, and so many conversations kicked off, and they're like, "Oh, I'm a new parent," or "Oh, I remember those days," and it like had this back and forth, and "Oh, what kind of stroller are you?" Like just things that were silly, but it was the start of an actual back and forth conversation, and so I always tell people, whatever channel you use, remember that when it comes to relationship, the measure of that is reciprocity. And reciprocity means it's this two-way back and forth. You can have amazing marketing in terms of conversions that doesn't build relationships. But if you see this word kind of bantered around a lot of like relationships, in my eyes, it's all around a two-way street of what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's really the ticket to any strategy, right? Is how do you make it into a personal relationship between the brand, between the staff, the internal and the external? Because we've all seen marketing that just shouts into the void, and that doesn't hit the same. It doesn't create that
Yeah,
stickiness. It doesn't create that loyalty on both sides. And it's easier to be dismissive of it later on down the line.
for sure. And it's crowded, right? Like it's a very crowded ecosystem. Like one of the things that I think is so important is that the things that were working 5 years ago, right? In terms of SEO, in terms of, a lot of these strategies, they've adapted. Like we're going in a new direction when it comes to content. And companies today have to be looking at those trends, looking at what's going forward, what's happening with search result zero, what's happening with voice, what's happening with original research. I'm a huge advocate of original research because I think it's one of the great ways to differentiate yourself. Go out there and actually try to conduct real research, gather firsthand information, talk to companies, look at your own data, and produce firsthand research. We have a lot of integration partners. I've talked with Shopify and a handful of these other companies that do like state of e-commerce 2023. Classy is a philanthropy type of company that gathers funding. They do like state of philanthropy 2023. Wistia does state of video 2022, right? Or whatever the year is. Those pieces of original research are really powerful. They drive a ton of backlinks, and they're something that I think is differentiable in a sea of like a million kind of like jobs to be done articles. Not that there still isn't utility around certain jobs to be done content, but just know that the ecosystem today is not the same as it was in the past. And because of that saturation, there's more of an onus on you to differentiate in a deeper way.
Yeah, and I think that that brings up the point that research isn't impossible. It's not that hard. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. You just have to go talk to people and accurately reflect what you found out. And you've done it, right? Like let's say you don't have a customer base that's very large. let's say that you're starting from scratch, like you're just blank piece of paper. What you need to do is tippity tap over to LinkedIn and, have a message of what you're trying, know what you're defining as your question, find 20 people, ask them your question, record a Zoom or use Gong where you can also get, how much they talked about and the words out of it, or just use the transcript and run it through something. And there's your research. It's a very small sample size. When you share your findings, state that your sample size is 20 people, but
Yeah.
that counts still. It's starting somewhere.
100%. And not only that, like I think there's so many different forums today that you can lean into. So if I'm trying to grab research like in the SaaS space, I might go to like Facebook groups like SaaS Founder. I might go to certain Reddit subreddits that might have some insight. I might go to places like Demand Curve on Slack, which has, a lot of people that are in my space. And those people are often really open giving you feedback. So if you have specific questions, I remember like one of the first times I started this way back in the day, I was trying to understand onboarding flows. And I just wanted to understand what the tempo was. I was like, I don't have a sense of like how often should I contact people? And it was awesome how many people, I think we got 140 people that responded back, letting us know their tempo. Like I messaged people 4 times in the first month. I messaged people 3 times. And it was super interesting to go through that data and be like, okay, now at least I have this ballpark of what everyone out there was doing. And it wasn't a paid thing. It was just going into these communities and kind of asking those questions. And I think if you do that, which helps give you a little bit of scale combined with the personal asks, where you can get a little bit more nuance, you get the scale, you get the nuance. That's a good pairing where you can get some really valuable stuff that you can turn into an original content piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And if nothing else, then it informs what you're trying to do.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
like
Win-win.
if nothing else, you have a picture in front of you, a map, of something to try. Because what I see a lot of people do is they get so stuck on the perfect this, the perfect that they don't just go out and do. And Casey, you're probably my favorite doer. Like I don't think of a better description of you than someone who just decides that he's going to do something and does it. And that follow through is the differentiator, right?
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. And I mean, definitely that's what I try, right? I attempt to test a lot of things. And like most people, I think a lot of these things won't work, right? But that's part of the iterative process of just putting yourself out there and experimenting. And I'll tell people that oftentimes way more doors than you think will open, right? Like so many opportunities I've had were cold pitch. I teach at university now. I cold pitched UC San Diego and I said, hey, I think there's a gap right now. We don't have a lot of people from industry. We have a lot of people that have PhDs and they're great on theory, but we don't have a lot of people that are active practitioners in academia. I think I can give some real insight from the traits I look at when I hire people for my team. And they said, yeah, that sounds awesome. Like, let's do this. And that just came from a cold email. The first course that I did, I reached out to the company and I said, here's my idea. And they said, let's fly you out to Texas and let's record this thing. And it just came together again from a cold email pitch where I reached out. And for every one of those that comes together, there's many that don't. But I think if you keep a good tempo of experimentation and reaching out, you'll be amazed the type of doors that open. And when I launched a podcast myself earlier this year, I had Nick Mehta, who sold his company for over $1 billion. And he was like, yeah, let's sit down and let's chat. And to me, that was like amazing. I was like, I couldn't believe that I was talking to someone of the caliber of Nick Mehta. And that came together just from asking, right? Just from reaching out on LinkedIn and saying, hey, you're an expert on customer lifetime value. I run a show on customer lifetime value. Let's sync up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had a similar experience. I haven't talked to Nick Mehta yet. Open door here, Nick. Uh, but I think the rejection sensitivity that people have is somewhat in their head, and that you have to just kind of get over it a little bit. And then I also want to provide context to people who have never looked at what it takes to have a course at a higher education place. If I was going to go today and I was going to look for a job posting to be a professor or, just have my own course at most colleges, they would have some just overly formalized list of like wish list of what they're looking for because that's what they think they need. They don't know that these people are going into the workplace and it's diluting their brand as a higher education because they're just kind of bumbling around with no idea what to do.
Mm.
And but if I was going to go today, I have a master's degree, but I wouldn't be quote unquote qualified because I don't have a PhD. Well, that's baloney. Like I have, plenty of I can do it, but I've never cold pitched. I've never asked to do it. And that's the difference between you and I is that you saw the need, you went after it, you had a plan, you cold pitched them and you provided value. And that's why you're a teacher. And I'm sitting here looking at job descriptions and be like, oh, but I don't have a PhD. Oh, poor me. Like, I'm not going to, I probably am now more inspired to go try it myself.
Yeah, I mean, first off, a couple things on that I'll note for anyone looking to get into the education world. First thing is, I will say it was the craziest and longest. Like, I'm teaching one course, right? So I'm teaching one specific course. I'm teaching it online, right? And with all that said, I think I filled out maybe like 40 different forms. I mean, it was just like insane the amount of like legwork for this like very part-time thing for a couple hours per week that you can set up. So I'll start with that. I'll also say that I do think that the specifics for teaching like as an online professor versus like in class, like standard curriculum may be different. I don't know. That would be an interesting thing that for me to test next would be to go from teaching online classes to like getting into the actual rooms and teaching. Um, but all that said, yeah, definitely experiment, get your foot in the door, can't hurt. The only caveat I will let you guys know is that education does not have a high payroll. So if your goal is to maximize dollars, probably not the best path for you. But if you're looking to have an impact, I think it's great.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And I was just calling to it an example of a situation that seems somewhat like hostile and somewhat elitist or somewhat hard to get into, hard to crack. But the thing is that sometimes if you're only looking at the traditional ways of breaking into something and you're not putting your own flair on it or your own value or thinking through it yourself in a different format, that you're really selling yourself short.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And there's often just so little downside. I think back to the very first product that I ever created. I was in college and I was buying and selling trading cards, like Magic the Gathering collectible trading cards. And one night I decided I'm going to write a e-guide about how to do that. And I'm going to list it on eBay. And that e-guide went on to sell over $10,000 of guides on eBay, right? And it was one night. And the thing is, like, there's so many times where it's like, okay, if that didn't work, like I write an e-guide and it doesn't work, then like, what's there to lose, right? And after I did that one specifically in that niche, I tried to write like 4 other ones that all flopped and didn't get like any sales. But what was really interesting about that is that was one of my first major lessons about this kind of concept I call traffic and trust. I realized like what do I need with any product that I create? I need traffic, and I hijacked eBay's traffic because they had a bunch of people that were searching, and I was now able to capture those keywords and grab their traffic. And then they had the built-in star system. So because I had a 99.7% positive feedback on eBay, that was the trust built in. And so that was like this eye-opening moment where I was like, wow, if I can find more ways to get traffic and to get trust, that can completely change the business. And I think that the trust aspect is definitely like a big cornerstone of what we were chatting about today, which is just like, how do you actually build that in a real way? Um, and I think being relatable and being human and having all those kind of different pieces can go a long way to facilitating that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that one of the hardest things for companies is like, oh, well, what does it even mean to be human? How do we be human? And they overthinking it. And video allows that exchange, that dialogue without it being too pedantic. Um
Yep.
and so coming from, how do you capture the traffic and the trust? Where do you think marketing is going and where do you think it should go as far as, ways that people can like narrow it down or strategies that might work or just things that you see on the horizon?
Yeah, for sure. So I talked about one of them, which is original research and people kind of diving in and changing that standard like SEO. I think that's going to continue to happen over time. I think that you're going to there's a lot of change. Like, the way that a lot of these big tech companies have risen and like created these massive pockets of competition, like the CRM/ESP game, there's just like a million different players. I think you're going to continue to see these tools like select down and become like Klaviyo is an example. Like Klaviyo is a tool that really was like, we're going to stay in e-commerce. This is our lane. This is where we're going to live. And I think you're going to see more and more press on that, because we kind of had a weird world. We kind of had a situation where everyone started as point solutions. Then everyone went into the second phase that says we all want to be all in one. The future is all in one. You're going to do your landing page and your text and your processing, and everything is going to be under one roof. But I think that over time, there's never going to be able to be a perfect all in one. There's just too many pieces, right? It's like you do your membership, you do your landing pages, you do your payment processing. It's like this huge world. So I think you're going to see differentiation down there. I think that you're going to see more of big data impacting things like I had mentioned this one earlier too, but things like result zero, right? Those things are important, right? Like nowadays, a lot of people, if they search for something and the result pops up, that's it. They don't need to click on anything. It just popped up and they wanted to know how much does a blue whale weigh? And now it says it, and they don't need to click into any article because they trust that result is out there. And so we won't have this be a whole discussion of like how you rank for result zero, but it just means that these are all considerations when you're talking with your content team around where to go. The other thing I think is super important, I think more and more teams are embracing, and I'm happy to see this narrative is getting out there, is more of a focus on distribution, not just on creation of content. And so, like, I think for so long, it's been like, let's create a content calendar. On my content calendar, I'm going to post on what days I'm going to post different pieces of content, and that's it. But I think the world today is not only about how do you create content, but how do you get it in front of as many eyes as possible, right? And so you start thinking about who are the partners, who are the specific different mediums that are going to help amplify this? Where are the different places I can get on and talk about this, right? So things like webinars, things like collaborative blog articles, things like podcasts, where you're going to get on and you're going to have meaningful conversations. And I think that one of the things I would say for people that are thinking about their marketing plan, one of the best places to start is what I call keystone beliefs. So the place I would start is I would say, what do you understand about the market that other people miss? Don't talk to me about your product. Talk to me about what you see in the market that is different, right? And have that then feed back. At the very end, it can have that connection back to the product. But that vision of like what you understand, that becomes what you get PR around. That becomes what makes the best content. That becomes your springboard to all those different marketing opportunities that you see lined up ahead of you. So I think those, I mean, we could spend a long time, I think, talking about the trajectories. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that's going to happen across the marketing realm and a lot of big changes. I would not be surprised by any means that if 20 years from now, email wasn't the major way people communicated anymore.
Oh, yeah.
That changed. And there's some other way now that everyone just like emails like this old antiquated thing. Like, so it's going to keep shifting gears for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that part of what you just said, the last part, like it made me think about, coming back to why, like when you understand a certain part of the market and you can springboard off that, it's because you understand the aspirational, the inspirational, the why of it, and that's reflected, in the jobs to be done. That's reflected in all of these other different frameworks, but really it's all the same thing. If you don't understand why people care or should care, or why they should talk to you, you don't have very much to go off of. And
Yeah.
it's really comes back to like that first point, and if you go back even further to translate that to why someone's searching for something, it's what's their intent? Why do they care? And
Yeah.
that's what makes the quality search results. And even if they aren't clicking to your site, you'll probably see your domain. They'll see your brand a little bit, and you don't necessarily have to get the traffic all the way to your page to be valuable to somebody.
And the other thing I'll say connected to the kind of part of this too is like I'm a big fan of direct attribution, and what I mean by direct attribution is asking people specifically like, how did you hear about us? And Chris Walker, who runs Refine Labs, has talked a lot about this in the public eye because their company does a lot around dark social, and he kind of talks about how if you don't ask people directly, often you get very bad attribution, right? And so that's something we've leaned into heavily as an organization, has really helped us make data informed decisions. It's also super straightforward and easy. So when you look, like there's so many different models, right? There's time decay and linear attribution and first and last and like, you know, there's a whole list of different ways you can look at it. And I think that for me, there is value in a lot of those models, but one of the most basic things that anyone can do, any startup, is just ask your customers, how did you hear about it? And they're going to tell you what they feel like they valued most, which in
Yeah.
many ways is one of the most salient, important insights. So I think as you're going in marketing, don't get stuck in the world of just so much analytics because you'll have endless access to analytics. And as someone who works with a lot of new teams, I have absolutely spent a lot of time sitting in rooms with people that spend months and months poring over every nuance of the analytic panels they've gotten and not executing and not taking action. And in my eyes, I'm like, look, use direct attribution, get the top level stuff, and then get started. And I don't want to give the impression that I'm a person who disregards data because I use data to inform decisions all the time, but I don't think you want to be paralyzed by it. And that's where things like direct attribution can really valuable for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the number one thing that people like the bone to pick that people have with self attribution is just like, well, what if they're misremembering? Well, does it matter? Like, I don't think it does sometimes. I mean, it
Yeah, I mean,
does. It does, but like it also doesn't because that's where they care the most about your
it,
interaction.
exactly. That's what I would say. It's like, how did you hear about us? It's like, well, if they put the third touch point, that's the one they remembered. Like, that's your insight, right? Like that tells you that's the thing that lasted in their memory and probably had the most persuasive power to them taking whatever decision they made. And also it's directional insight. So part of that not getting paralyzed by data is look, some people might skip it, right? If it's optional, obviously, some people might tell you the wrong thing. They might misclick. That's true of any intake form you're going to possibly have with information. But if you have even like, 100 people that fill it out in a given month, you're going to be able to see directional insights that are going to tell you what the answer is. And so we look at, podcasting as an example is one of the things that people can select. And we know that isn't exactly accurate because there's so many ways that's hard to measure from outside, but it gives us good directional insight. And we can say, hey, this is 20% higher than our baseline this month. And every other month, if we say like, oh, it might be misreporting by say 25%, well, every other month it might be misreporting by 25%. So you look at the change velocity, and that's going to be able to tell you what you want to know. So as long as you can build a baseline, that variance actually doesn't really change the core decision because the core decision is like based on attribution data, what do you do? That's what matters, right? How do you change your content? How do you change your messaging? How do you modify that page? That's why you do attribution, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And, I'm just having stats flashback, like, oh, the standard deviation, like, and all that. But because I do spend a lot of time looking at analytics. But, at the same time, there's a lot of truth in it, is that you just have to pick a lane. You have to pick what your variance is gonna be, hopefully you do it in a mathematical way instead of I feel like way. But at the same time, there is that creativity and that insight into it as long as you're consistent month to month. Just pick a lane. Um,
Yeah.
so this has been so much to digest, right? This has been such a great conversation. If someone wanted to follow up with you and have a conversation with you one on one or just hear more of what you had to say, what is the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Yeah, two ways. You can go to LinkedIn. Very active on LinkedIn. I post pretty much daily, and you can just find me at Casey Hill. So LinkedIn/Casey Hill, CaseyHill. Definitely feel free to follow me and connect with me there. Or you can message me directly. My email is Casey, CASEY at Bonjoro, BONJORO.com. You're welcome to shoot me a message and drop me a line if you have questions there as well.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'm thankful that you spelled it out because sometimes Casey has a K. You never know. Uh,
Yes. And
y-
and almost everyone also says Bonjoro as Bongiorno. So
or
there's
bonjour, it could be
yeah, or
anything.
Bonzo. Yeah.
Um, so I probably at least once put a U in it. There is no U. There's only O's.
Yeah.
Um, thank you again for being my guest. And, I look forward to sharing this. And if anyone ever has any questions for me, it's just info at Markigy, another thing that's hard to spell, Markigy. And that's .com. And, thanks again for listening and for being here.
Awesome. Bye, Leanne.
You've been listening to Markigy, the science of marketing strategy. If any of the strategies we talked about today inspired you to learn more, try them. Remember, the perfect strategy doesn't exist, only the one that gets done. Subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast player to make sure that you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening. Until next time.